All right, I want to spend two lectures talking about the economics of Western expansion. There are four key economic drivers. We're going to talk about two of them in this lecture and two in the next lecture. But first I want to talk about what I mean by Western expansion. One of the most remarkable features of the post-Civil War period in America was the expansion of the European-American frontier westward. From 1865 to 1890, the white population west of the 95th meridian, which is that line I've shown here, from Galveston through Abilene through western Minnesota. The white population west of that meridian increased 400% to about 8.5 million. That's a growth rate of 5 times that of the nation as a whole. And the nation as a whole was growing very rapidly at this time. As much farming and grazing land came under cultivation by white Americans during these 25 years as during the previous 2.5 centuries. Through various broad legislative acts like the Homestead Act to give land to people, the Morrill Land Grant Acts, which gave land to states to build universities like Mississippi State and Auburn, the Railroad Acts, which gave land to railroad companies to build railroads. Through those kind of acts, some 400 million acres passed into private ownership from government ownership. American farms more than doubled from 2.5 million to 6 million. And here's the most important fact. Agricultural output increased between 2 to 3-fold. That was considerably more than the population increase. So we started making a lot more agricultural commodities. This growth, however, had some social, environmental, and economic cost. One of the costs was that Indians basically lost their remaining land and were herded onto reservations, increasingly smaller reservations. They kept shrinking. Here we see some Shoshone Indians on a reservation in Wyoming. And this was obviously a great social cost. Some of the environmental cost. Buffalo were hunted almost to extinction. That picture on the right is a mountain of buffalo skulls. People wanted buffaloes only for their buffalo robes, which were like lap robes and coats, very popular in the East, and also to make leather for industrial belting and so forth, but not the rest of the buffalo. The Indians, of course, had used all of them, but they were hunted almost to extinction. Millions of acres of grasslands and forests were cut down and plowed up in the settlement process, setting the stage for destructive erosion, floods, and dust bowls in future generations. Overproduction in agriculture led to a collapse in prices and a worldwide agricultural depression by the late 1880s. I mentioned, remember, that agricultural output increased in this period from 2 to 3-fold. Much bigger supply means lower price, which created some problems in the international financial community. One point I want to make is that while the myth is that rugged individualism and self-reliance is what conquered the West, the federal government played the key role. The Army to clear out the Indians and make places stable. The Homestead Act of 1862, giving land to people, and these heavy railroad subsidies. The federal government was the key driver of Western expansion, not rugged individualism. All right, economic driver number one is settlers coming in and settling and creating consumers out in this new wilderness. And settlers began really in a big way with the railroads. There were 5 transcontinental railroads completed between 1869 and 1893. The Pacific Railroad Act created the first one. At the end of the Civil War, there were only 3,272 miles of railroad west of the Mississippi. By 1890, there were 72,000 plus miles of railroad. And this spurred settlement and economic development that came with settlement. In the decade following the Pacific Railroad Act, Congress gave railroads 170 million acres, worth over $500 million. Minnesota and Washington deeded it wasn't just the federal government, state governments. Minnesota and Washington deeded 1/4 of their state lands to railroad companies. Wisconsin, Iowa, Kansas, North Dakota, Montana, they needed about a fifth of their lands. Railroads were therefore uniquely positioned to shape the West as they saw fit. Railroads wanted inhabitants, obviously. They would build a railroad, making the land they'd been given along the road all of a sudden much more valuable. But they had to recruit people to come live there, and so they used a variety of aggressive marketing tactics to attract these people. One consequence, unintended consequence of this marketing effort was to make land available to single women, known as girl homesteaders, to set up farms near family members. In Wyoming, single women were over 18% of the land claimants. So we have a lot of women settlers, surprisingly. Unsurprisingly, however, the West led the way in women having political power. Wyoming was the first state to give women the vote in 1869, many decades before this happened nationally. Railroads also recruited abroad, bringing 2.2 million immigrants to the West between 1870 and 1900. Some agents even recruited whole villages of Germans and East Europeans to relocate to the North Dakota plains. Land was a lot more plentiful in North America than in Europe. Many black freedmen also immigrated to the plains following their freedom at the end of the war. Now, railroads had a great influence on agriculture. They sold this land to people they recruited, and to encourage quick repayment for the land they sold, they said, you need to make money. You need to grow cash crops, wheat on the northern plains, corn in Iowa and Kansas, cotton and tobacco in Texas. This way farmers could grow commodities, cash crops, and earn cash, money, with which to repay the railroads. But this made farmers vulnerable to volatile market forces, and because we're putting all of these other commodities, this land in production, increasing production of commodities, as I've already alluded, this collapsed prices, and it sort of tied these settlers to international markets that were completely beyond their control. Generous land laws were another powerful draw for settlers. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and it had promised 160 acres to settlers who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. You go there, you make the claim, you live there for 5 years and build a little house and maybe put some fences up, work the land, and after 5 years it is yours for free. Brits, Scandinavians, other Europeans took advantage. Again, land was prohibitively expensive in Europe. And although 400,000 families claimed land under the Act between 1860 and 1900, the law really did not function as was envisioned. It was tough to make it work, and speculators filed false claims for the choicest areas. And states and railroads acquired huge land holdings. So really only 1 acre in 9 went to true pioneer homesteaders. A second problem resulting from the Homestead Act was from the 160-acre limit. In very rich soils, 160 acres was enough for a viable farm, but in drier areas it was not. So in 1873, Congress passed the Timber Culture Act, giving settlers an additional 160 acres if they planted trees on 40 acres of that additional 160. This was particularly beneficial in places like the plains where there just weren't any trees. It also prevented erosion. This was authored by Senator Phineas Hitchcock from Nebraska. For arid states, Congress passed the Desert Land Act in 1877. That gave 640 acres, but you had to pay. It was $1.25 an acre, very cheap. If the owner would agree to irrigate it within 3 years. So obviously it's tougher with these arid places, but you can get a much larger amount of land. All of these measures, however, were exploited by speculators, lumber companies, and large ranchers filing false claims. And so these legislative actions did keep the dream of the West alive, but huge land holdings were amassed by a handful of people, stratification of wealth in the form of land. Now, in addition to unscrupulous land speculators and arid conditions, which made farming difficult, settlers faced daunting psychological challenges in adjusting to frontier life. Working constantly to build a house and scratch out a farm was just very, very difficult, especially when done in isolation. You know, the nearest house might be miles away. Here we see a sod house. In the plains, there were no trees, so you would dig out chunks of the earth and use that to create blocks with which to build your house. That's why they have, you know, plants growing on the house there. So this Eden-like ideal really faded quickly for most people, and they just gave up. It was hard. Nearly half who staked homestead claims in Kansas, for example, between 1862 and 1890, relinquished their claims and moved on. Nearly half. The persistence was much higher in Minnesota and the Pacific Northwest, and partly because there were a lot of Germans and Scandinavians that settled there, and they had traditions of family prosperity and generational land ownership, which some of these American homesteaders did not. All right, so settlement driven by railroads was economic driver number one. Economic driver number two is mining. In the 50 years following the California gold rush of 1849, hence the phrase, you know, 49ers, a series of mining booms occurred in the Southwest, all the way up into Canada and Alaska. Discoveries in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California produced $81 million worth of gold bullion in 1852. By the 1870s, silver mining was an even bigger industry in the West. Very famously, the first great silver lode came in 1853 when Henry Comstock, who was an illiterate prospector, discovered the Comstock lode along the Carson River in Nevada. After that, prospectors next discovered gold and silver in the Rockies near Denver. Gold was then discovered in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, and in 1896 in the Canadian Klondike. Although accounts of prospectors dredging up gold by the panful, were exaggerated, $1 billion worth of gold bullion had been mined in California alone by 1900. A few prospectors became wealthy, but most did not. Comstock, for example, sold out one of his claims for $11,000 and another one for 2 mules. So most people didn't get rich. Gold and silver, however, weren't the only minerals sought. Others increased in value and demand due to technological advancements. Montana, for example, produced huge amounts of copper. Here we have an old copper mine in Montana. And copper was needed by the inventions of the telephone in 1876, the incandescent light bulb in 1879, and the electrical generator in 1881. These new industries out east were driven by and further drove Western expansion. Violence was ubiquitous in mining as people fought over claims. As placer mining, panning in streams gave out, large companies increasingly turned to hydraulic mining, producing these giant heaps, these tailings from deep bores, and strip mining, where you just cut the top of the mountain off to get to the minerals. Because these large deposits were deep down, large-scale enterprises were necessary to mine them. These weren't done by individual prospectors with a shovel. These were huge enterprises, and either Eastern and or British capital was invested and took the lion's share. So this was a corporate phenomenon by and large. One feature of this mining industry was violence. As large corporations took over the mining, very violent strikes occurred. The Coeur d'Alene strike in Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in 1892, Cripple Creek, Colorado in 1894, in 1903 at a number of places. What would happen when these strikes would occur, these violent strikes, Western governors would call out the National Guard to suppress the strikers, and this happened 10 times between 1892 and 1904, just 12 years. The Guard was called out 10 times. The Western Federation of Miners emerged as a union in 1893 and became one of the most militant American unions. Life in mining towns was lively and unpredictable. Some, like Virginia City, Nevada, quickly emerged as large towns with elaborate mansions, multi-storied hotels, opera houses, dozens of saloons, multiple banks, and brothels. One unintended consequence of the gold rush, continuing gold rush, was the settlement of Alaska. There were small strikes made there in 1869, just 2 years after we purchased it. Joe Juneau, for whom the capital of Juneau is named, and others developed the Treadwell mine. Gold miners flooding into the Canadian Klondike in 1897 are what enabled Alaska to establish its own territorial government in 1912. One of the easy ways to get to the Klondike, if you look here, is to take a ferry to Alaska. And so this is what brought enough people to Alaska to establish territorial status. Mining enriched a few and certainly stimulated the economy and helped usher the U.S. into the mainstream of the world economy. But it came at significant environmental cost, however.